August 28, 1945. Atsugi Airfield, 30 miles southwest of Tokyo. Private First Class Robert Eichelberger stepped down from the C-47 transport onto Japanese soil and felt his rifle grip slick with nervous sweat despite the late summer heat. Around him, the first wave of American occupation forces fanned out across the tarmac with weapons ready, scanning the treeline for threats that never materialized. The airfield was silent except for the wind moving through damaged buildings and the distant sound of the ocean. What Eichelberger expected to see was what 4 years of war had taught him to expect. Fanatical resistance. Suicide attacks. Civilians charging American positions with bamboo spears and hand grenades hidden under their clothing. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, he'd seen Japanese soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender. He'd watched civilians on Saipan throw themselves and their children from cliffs rather than accept American occupation. Every briefing, every intelligence report, every whispered story from other units had reinforced the same message. The Japanese would never surrender their homeland. They would make every street of every city a killing ground. They would sacrifice their entire population before accepting defeat. The American military had prepared for casualties that would dwarf anything seen in Europe. Projected losses for the invasion of the Japanese home islands ran into the hundreds of thousands. Operation Downfall, the planned assault, anticipated fighting that would last into 1946 or beyond, with American forces grinding through urban warfare against an enemy that had spent months fortifying every city, training every civilian to fight, stockpiling weapons in schools and temples and hospitals. But Eichelberger was not landing in the midst of battle. He was landing in a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The airfield was empty. The approach to Tokyo was quiet. And as American forces moved cautiously through the outskirts of the capital in those first hours, what they encountered was not armed resistance but groups of Japanese civilians standing motionless beside the roads, watching the conquerors arrive with expressions that mixed fear, exhaustion, and something else. Something that looked almost like relief. For the Japanese civilians watching American troops pour into their country, the fear ran just as deep but in different directions. They had been told by their government for months that American soldiers were monsters. Devils who would rape every woman, murder every man, enslave every child. Official propaganda had shown American troops as savages who tortured prisoners, desecrated shrines, treated Asian people as subhuman. Posters distributed throughout Japanese cities depicted GIs as demons with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts warned of atrocities that would follow American occupation. Civilians had been instructed that suicide was preferable to capture. Michiko Tanaka was 17 years old when American forces entered Tokyo. She lived with her mother and 2 younger sisters in a wooden house that had survived the firebombing campaigns by pure chance. Their neighborhood was a landscape of ash and charred timber where houses had stood just months before. Food was scarce. Medical care was non-existent. Her father had died in the Philippines 2 years earlier. Her older brother had been killed defending Okinawa. When word spread that American troops were moving into their district, Michiko's mother gathered her daughters and explained in a flat, emotionless voice that when the Americans came, they would do things that couldn't be prevented. She told them not to resist because resistance would only make it worse. She told them to accept whatever happened because they would all be killed anyway. She said this calmly as if discussing the weather because she believed every word. Michiko waited in her house for the Americans to arrive. She waited for the violence she'd been promised. She waited to die or worse. What she did not expect was what actually happened when the first American soldier appeared in her doorway 3 days after the occupation began. He was young, maybe 20 years old. He wore his helmet pushed back on his head and carried his rifle slung over one shoulder. He knocked on the damaged doorframe before entering, which struck Michiko as absurd and somehow terrifying in its politeness. He held up his hands to show they were empty. He spoke words in English that Michiko couldn't understand, but his tone wasn't threatening. He reached into his pack and pulled out 3 chocolate bars. He held them out to the 3 sisters and gestured for them to take them. Michiko's hands were shaking so badly she dropped the chocolate bar twice before managing to hold it. The American soldier nodded, said something else in his incomprehensible language and left. He didn't touch anyone. He didn't threaten anyone. He gave them candy and walked away. Michiko stood in her ruined doorway, holding a Hershey's chocolate bar, trying to reconcile what had just happened with everything she'd been told would happen. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that she began to cry, not from fear or relief but from the overwhelming confusion of a worldview collapsing in real time. This scene repeated itself in countless variations across Japan in those first weeks of occupation. American soldiers expecting fanatical resistance encountered exhausted civilians who were too traumatized and hungry to fight. Japanese civilians expecting atrocities encountered young American men who were homesick, tired of war, and generally decent to people who weren't shooting at them. The collision between expectation and reality was so jarring for both sides that it created a kind of psychological whiplash that would reshape how these two peoples understood each other. The American military government had prepared extensive plans for occupation, but those plans were built on assumptions about resistance that never materialized. General Douglas MacArthur had established Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers headquarters in Tokyo and immediately began issuing directives about demilitarization, land reform and constitutional revision. But the implementation of those policies depended on millions of daily interactions between American servicemen and Japanese civilians, and those interactions were creating a reality that no strategic planner had anticipated. The silence of those first days was deceptive. Underneath the exhaustion and shock, both populations were trying to process an impossible situation. Americans who had fought across the Pacific with the belief that every Japanese person was a potential enemy now found themselves administering cities full of civilians who seemed more defeated than dangerous. Japanese who had been raised to believe in their racial and spiritual superiority over Westerners now found themselves dependent on those same Westerners for food, medicine, and physical survival. Something fundamental was shifting, though few could articulate what it was in those early weeks. The war had ended with atomic weapons and imperial surrender, but the real transformation was happening in much quieter moments. In a chocolate bar given to hungry children. In an American soldier helping an elderly Japanese man clear rubble from his destroyed home. In a Japanese woman teaching a GI how to properly bow in greeting. In a shared cigarette between men who had been trying to kill each other just weeks earlier. The images both sides had carried in their heads were dissolving, and something new was forming in their place. But transformation is rarely comfortable, and the process that would reshape Japanese-American relations began not with dramatic gestures but with small, awkward, confusing encounters between people who didn't speak each other's languages and didn't understand each other's cultures but who shared the same ruined landscape and the same desperate desire to simply survive. The occupation of Japan required approximately 350,000 American troops at its peak, spread across the entire Japanese archipelago from Hokkaido to Kyushu. These were not specially trained diplomats or cultural experts. They were mostly young men, drafted or enlisted, who had spent the previous years fighting a brutal war and who wanted nothing more than to go home. They had been told they were occupying a defeated enemy, and most expected to be treated with the mixture of fear and hatred that defeated enemies typically show to victors. What they found instead was something more complicated and more human than military doctrine had prepared them for. The Japanese population in the summer and fall of 1945 was traumatized beyond anything Americans could easily comprehend. The firebombing campaigns had destroyed 66 major cities. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had killed over 200,000 people in seconds and left survivors with injuries that defied medical understanding. Millions of Japanese soldiers were dead or missing. The merchant marine had been annihilated, cutting off food imports. Industrial production had collapsed. The infrastructure that allowed cities to function had been systematically destroyed. What this meant in practical terms was that Japanese civilians were starving, displaced, injured, and without access to basic services like clean water, sanitation, or medical care. The social order that had governed Japanese life had disintegrated along with the military government's credibility. People were focused on immediate survival with an intensity that left little room for ideological resistance or nationalistic fervor. Sergeant William Harmon from Pennsylvania found himself assigned to a civil affairs unit in Yokohama in September 1945. His job was to help distribute food rations and ensure that displaced civilians were being housed in whatever buildings remained standing. He'd fought from Guadalcanal to Okinawa and had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes. He expected to hate this occupation duty, expected to feel like he was helping people who had killed his friends. His first morning in Yokohama, he supervised the distribution of rice to a crowd of several hundred Japanese civilians outside a warehouse. The crowd was silent and orderly to a degree that seemed almost unnatural. People lined up without pushing or shoving. When they received their rations, they bowed deeply before leaving. Children held their mother's hands and didn't cry even when they were clearly hungry. An elderly Japanese man approached Harmon after receiving his rice ration. He was thin to the point of emaciation and wore clothes that had been repaired so many times they were more patched than original fabric. He bowed low, then bowed again, then spoke in Japanese while making gestures that indicated his household. He pulled out a photograph from his pocket and showed it to Harmon. It was a picture of a young man in an Imperial Japanese Navy uniform. Harmon stared at the photograph and realized the old man was showing him his son. The old man continued speaking in Japanese, and while Harmon couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. The old man was explaining that his son was dead, that the family had received notification months ago. He wasn't asking for anything or complaining. He was simply sharing this information with the American sergeant standing in front of him, one father to another, acknowledging loss in the only way he knew how. Harmon found himself nodding even though he had no idea what to say. He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 cans of Spam and a pack of cigarettes. He handed them to the old man who looked shocked and tried to refuse. Harmon insisted, gesturing for him to take them. The old man bowed so deeply that Harmon thought he might fall over. When he straightened up, there were tears running down his face. Later, Harmon wrote to his wife in Pennsylvania trying to explain what had happened. He struggled to articulate the strangeness of feeling sympathy for people he'd been taught to hate. He wrote about the old man in the photograph and the bow and the tears. He wrote that he didn't know how to feel about any of it, that the rules he'd used to understand the world weren't working anymore, that everything was more complicated than anyone had told him it would be. These kinds of encounters multiplied across Japan as American forces spread through the country. Language barriers created constant confusion, but they also forced a kind of simplified communication that sometimes led to clearer understanding. Without words, people relied on gestures, facial expressions, shared activities. An American soldier helping lift a beam off a trapped person didn't need to speak Japanese. A Japanese civilian offering water to a thirsty GI didn't need to speak English. Basic human decency translated without vocabulary. For Japanese civilians, the realization that Americans were not the monsters described in propaganda came in stages. The first stage was simple relief at not being immediately murdered. The second stage was surprise at receiving food and medical care instead of systematic brutality. The third stage was the slow, uncomfortable recognition that the enemy looked like people. They laughed. They got homesick. They showed each other photographs of girlfriends and family. They got drunk and sang sad songs. They complained about officers and army food. They did all the mundane, ordinary things that revealed them to be human rather than demonic. Yuki Nakamura was a schoolteacher in Nagano Prefecture, in the mountains west of Tokyo. Her town had escaped major bombing but had received evacuees from Tokyo and other destroyed cities. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. When American forces arrived in November 1945, Yuki expected them to requisition what little food remained and leave the population to starve. Instead, American military government officers immediately organized food distribution programs. They brought in rice that had been stockpiled in Okinawa and the Philippines. They established medical clinics staffed by army doctors who treated Japanese civilians alongside American personnel. They started repair work on damaged infrastructure without demanding forced labor from the local population. Yuki watched all of this with deep suspicion. She assumed there must be some ulterior motive, some hidden cruelty that would emerge once the Americans had consolidated their control. But weeks passed, then months, and the cruelty never materialized. The food kept coming. The medical clinics remained open. American soldiers walked through town and waved to children and bought vegetables from market vendors using occupation script that actually had value because the military government backed it. The psychological adjustment required to accept this reality was profound. Yuki had to confront the fact that her government had lied to her about almost everything. Not just about the conduct of the war or the likelihood of victory, but about the fundamental nature of the people Japan had been fighting. If Americans weren't monsters, then what had all the sacrifice been for? What did it mean that millions had died fighting an enemy who turned out to be capable of mercy? These questions didn't have comfortable answers, and many Japanese civilians dealt with them by simply focusing on survival and not thinking too deeply about the implications. But the questions remained, creating a kind of cognitive dissonance that would take years to fully resolve. For American soldiers, the adjustment was different but equally challenging. They had been conditioned by years of war to see Japanese people as a monolithic enemy. The propaganda had been effective. Racist caricatures had been commonplace. The rules of engagement in the Pacific had been brutal because both sides treated each other with a savagery that shocked observers from other theaters. But occupation duty forced American servicemen to see Japanese people as individuals rather than as an undifferentiated enemy mass. They met children who were just children, not junior fanatics. They met mothers worried about their families, not mindless servants of the emperor. They met old men who wanted to rebuild their homes and get back to normal life, not suicidal warriors pledged to fight to the death. Corporal James Turner from Mississippi found himself assigned to civil affairs work in Sendai, a city in northern Japan that had been heavily bombed. His job was to coordinate reconstruction efforts with local Japanese officials. His first meeting with the city's provisional government was awkward and tense. Nobody spoke each other's language well. The Japanese officials were clearly terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing. Turner was uncomfortable with the level of deference they showed him, the constant bowing and apologizing for things that weren't their fault. But over weeks and months, Turner developed working relationships with these officials. They figured out ways to communicate. They shared frustrations about supply shortages and bureaucratic nonsense from higher headquarters. They worked together to prioritize which buildings to repair first and how to distribute limited resources. Turner found himself respecting their competence and their genuine concern for the welfare of their city's population. This respect created its own kind of confusion. Turner had grown up in a Jim Crow South where racial hierarchies were enforced by law and violence. He'd been raised to believe that white people were superior and that other races were lesser. The war had reinforced these beliefs with propaganda about Japanese subhumanity. But here he was, working alongside Japanese officials who were clearly intelligent, dedicated, and trying their best in an impossible situation. The cognitive dissonance was severe enough that Turner stopped writing home about his experiences because he didn't know how to explain what he was feeling to his family in Mississippi. The encounters between American GIs and Japanese civilians in those first months created thousands of individual moments of recognition. Recognition that the propaganda had been lies. Recognition that the enemy was human. Recognition that people on both sides had been used by governments that cared more about power than about the lives of their citizens. These recognitions didn't erase the trauma of war or excuse the atrocities committed by both sides. But they created possibilities that hadn't existed before. If adults on both sides struggled with the cognitive dissonance of peaceful coexistence, children became the unexpected bridge between two cultures trying to learn how to exist in the same space. Japanese children, young enough to be more curious than fearful, approached American soldiers with a directness that often startled GIs who had been expecting hostility or at least suspicion. The first tool of this bridge building was food. American soldiers had access to supplies that seemed inexhaustible by Japanese standards. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, canned fruit, crackers, candy, things that American servicemen took for granted became treasures of almost mythical value to Japanese children who had grown up during wartime deprivation. Many had never tasted chocolate. Sugar had been rationed to the point of non-existence for civilian populations. The sight and smell of American PX rations represented abundance that seemed impossible. GIs discovered quickly that sharing food with children was both the easiest form of communication and the most effective way to defuse tension in a neighborhood. Within weeks of occupation beginning, American soldiers walking through Japanese towns found themselves surrounded by children calling out chocolate and candy and hello in accents that turned the English words into something musical and strange. Private Daniel McMahon from Boston found himself assigned to a motor pool in Kobe in October 1945. His job was routine maintenance work on military vehicles, but his base was located near a residential neighborhood that had survived the bombing raids largely intact. The first time he walked through the neighborhood to get to the civilian market where off-duty soldiers could buy sake and local food, a group of Japanese children followed him at a distance, whispering to each other and occasionally giggling. McMahon stopped and turned around. The children froze. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a Hershey bar, broke it into pieces and held them out. The children approached slowly, almost suspicious, like animals approaching food that might be a trap. The bravest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, darted forward, grabbed a piece of chocolate and ran back to his friends. After a moment the others followed. McMahon continued to his destination with the children now following more closely, chattering in Japanese and showing the chocolate to each other like it was made of gold. When he came back the same way an hour later, the children were waiting for him. This time they bowed when he approached, a gesture that made McMahon uncomfortable because it seemed too formal, too serious. He gave them more candy and tried to learn their names, mangling the pronunciation badly enough that the children laughed. This routine repeated itself every time McMahon left base. The same children would be waiting. They started bringing friends. Soon there was a crowd of 20 or 30 children who knew the schedule of when American soldiers typically walked through their neighborhood. McMahon started bringing extra supplies specifically to share. Other soldiers did the same. The children began to learn English words. The soldiers learned a few Japanese phrases. The interactions were simple, transactional in some sense, but they created relationships where none had existed before. Japanese parents watched these interactions with complex emotions. On one hand, their children were receiving food that was desperately needed. On the other hand, they were fraternizing with the enemy, with the people who had bombed their cities and killed their fathers and brothers. The propaganda warning against American savagery hadn't included scenarios where those same Americans would give chocolate to children and try to learn their names. Kenji Sato was 9 years old during the first winter of occupation. He lived in Tokyo with his mother and grandmother. His father had died in China 3 years earlier. The family house had burned in the March 1945 firebombing, and they now lived in a one-room shelter cobbled together from salvaged materials. Food was scarce. Kenji's grandmother gave her portion to the boy, claiming she wasn't hungry even as she grew thinner each day. Kenji had learned where American soldiers gave out rations and made it his job to get there early each day. He became friendly with a soldier from California named Tommy who gave him extra food and showed him comic books. Tommy taught Kenji English words by pointing at objects and saying their names. Kenji taught Tommy Japanese words the same way. They communicated in a mixture of both languages, supplemented with gestures and drawings in the dirt. Tommy showed Kenji photographs of his family in California. Kenji was fascinated by the images of a house with a yard and a car in the driveway. It looked like something from a movie, impossibly prosperous and peaceful. Tommy told him about Hollywood and baseball and hamburgers. Kenji told Tommy about school before the war and about the beach where his family used to go in summer. They became, in their limited way, friends. When Kenji brought food home to his mother and grandmother, he talked about Tommy constantly. His mother listened with an expression that mixed gratitude and discomfort. She appreciated the food but worried about her son forming attachments to American soldiers who would eventually leave and who represented a power structure that had destroyed their country. But she didn't stop him from going because the food was necessary for their survival, and because seeing her son animated and hopeful was better than seeing him hungry and depressed. The relationships between American soldiers and Japanese children created patterns that would influence Japanese society for decades. Children who grew up with positive experiences of Americans became adults with fundamentally different views of the United States than those who had only experienced war. They learned English because they wanted to communicate with the friendly soldiers who gave them candy. They absorbed American cultural references through movies, music and magazines that soldiers shared. They developed affection for individual Americans that complicated the simplified narratives about enemies and occupiers. The American military government recognized the strategic value of these relationships and began organizing them systematically. They established recreation centers where Japanese children could play under American supervision. They organized sports leagues where GIs coached Japanese kids in baseball, a sport that would become hugely popular in post-war Japan partly because of these early programs. They set up English classes and cultural exchange programs. The military framed this as part of the democratization effort, but the real impact was more subtle and more powerful than any policy directive could achieve. Individual soldiers became personally invested in the welfare of Japanese children they'd gotten to know. They sent money back to support orphanages. They arranged for medical care. They used their connections to help families get housing or employment. These weren't official programs but spontaneous acts of compassion that happened because seeing a child suffering triggers responses that transcend national boundaries or wartime animosities. Captain Richard Foster served as a civil affairs officer in Hiroshima in early 1946. His duties included overseeing relief efforts and coordinating reconstruction. The scale of destruction in Hiroshima was beyond anything he'd encountered in other Japanese cities. The atomic bomb had created a kind of devastation that seemed almost biblical in its completeness. Survivors suffered from radiation sickness that doctors didn't fully understand yet. Children orphaned by the blast lived in makeshift shelters and scrounged for food in the ruins. Foster organized a program to provide daily meals to orphan children. He requisitioned supplies from military stocks and recruited volunteers from his unit to help with distribution. The program started with about 50 children and grew to several hundred as word spread. Foster found himself spending hours each day with these kids, learning their names, hearing their stories, trying to help them process trauma that no child should have to experience. One girl about 8 years old had lost her entire family in the blast. She was severely burned and had trouble walking. Foster arranged for her to receive treatment from Army Medical Corps. He visited her regularly in the hospital, bringing books and candy. He showed her pictures of his own daughter back in Ohio who was about the same age. The girl asked him, in careful English she'd learned from other soldiers, if all American children had enough food and if their houses were still standing. Foster said yes and saw the girl process that information with a mixture of wonder and something that might have been envy but was mostly just sadness that the war had created such different realities. Foster wrote in his diary that working with the Hiroshima orphans was both the hardest thing he'd done in his entire military service and the most meaningful. He wrote that these children had done nothing to deserve what happened to them, that trying to help them felt like partial redemption for the collective violence that had brought them all to this moment. He wrote that he couldn't hate Japanese people anymore, not after seeing what war had done to the innocents caught in its machinery. The children became ambassadors for a future that most adults couldn't yet imagine. They showed that people who had been enemies could share space peacefully. They proved that language barriers could be overcome. They demonstrated that kindness was possible even in circumstances shaped by enormous violence and loss. These lessons wouldn't fully flower for years, but the seeds were being planted in countless interactions between American soldiers and Japanese children across the archipelago in those first months of occupation. Food is perhaps the most fundamental human need and the most powerful tool of cultural exchange. In post-war Japan, food scarcity created desperation that overrode propaganda and political ideology. American control of food distribution gave the occupation government enormous power, but it also created unexpected opportunities for connection between Japanese civilians and American servicemen. The contrast in food availability between American military bases and Japanese civilian populations was stark. American bases had well-stocked mess halls serving 3 substantial meals a day. Soldiers had access to PX stores filled with snacks, candy, and luxury items. Meanwhile, Japanese civilians existed on starvation rations that provided barely enough calories to sustain life. The average Japanese diet in late 1945 consisted primarily of rice when available, supplemented with whatever vegetables or protein could be scrounged, bartered, or grown. This disparity created both resentment and opportunity. Some Japanese civilians viewed the abundance of American food with anger, seeing it as the conqueror flaunting their wealth. But others saw opportunity for trade, connection, and survival. Black markets flourished where American goods were exchanged for Japanese currency, artwork, or services. But beyond economic transactions, food became a medium for cultural exchange that transcended the categories of victor and vanquished. Sergeant Howard Chin was a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco assigned to an Army kitchen in Yokosuka Naval Base. His job was cooking meals for several hundred American servicemen, a routine assignment that became more interesting when he started venturing into the city during off hours. Chin spoke Cantonese and some Mandarin, which helped him communicate basics with Japanese civilians even though the languages were different. More importantly, he was interested in Japanese food and wanted to understand what people ate. He started visiting local restaurants that were still operating despite shortages. Most served simple meals: miso soup, rice, pickled vegetables, maybe a small piece of fish if the day's catch had been good. The portions were tiny by American standards, carefully measured to stretch limited supplies. Chin ate these meals and talked with the proprietors through gestures and the few words they shared. He learned about Japanese cooking techniques, about the importance of umami flavors, about how every grain of rice was precious. Chin began experimenting in the army kitchen, trying to recreate Japanese dishes using American military supplies. He made a version of tonkatsu using spam instead of pork cutlets. He created miso soup from bouillon cubes and soy sauce. He tried to make onigiri rice balls using standard mess hall rice. The results were comically inauthentic, but his Japanese friends in the city appreciated the effort. They taught him better techniques. They showed him how to properly cook rice, how to use a sharp knife to get thin slices, how to arrange food to be visually appealing even when quantities were small. More significantly, Chin started inviting local Japanese cooks to the army base to help prepare meals for special occasions. The base commander approved this as part of civil affairs outreach. Japanese cooks got access to plentiful ingredients they couldn't obtain otherwise. American soldiers got to taste authentic Japanese cuisine. Both groups got to interact in the shared language of food preparation and consumption. These interactions revealed common ground that transcended national differences. Professional cooks on both sides recognized skill and artistry in each other's work. The Japanese cooks were impressed by the abundance of American ingredients and the efficiency of military kitchens. American cooks appreciated the precision and aesthetic sensibility of Japanese cooking. They traded techniques, shared recipes, and developed mutual respect based on their craft. In homes across Japan, similar exchanges happened on a smaller scale. American soldiers billeted with Japanese families or assigned to supervise local government offices found themselves invited to share meals. These were often uncomfortable occasions at first. The formality of Japanese dining customs confused American GIs. Sitting on tatami mats hurt American backs unaccustomed to floor seating. The unfamiliar flavors of fermented soybeans or pickled daikon took getting used to. But sharing a meal together is an act of trust and intimacy that creates bonds even when words fail. A Japanese mother serving food to an American soldier who might have killed her son was an act of humanity that transcended the categories of war. An American soldier eating food prepared by the enemy and finding it delicious was a recognition that culture and cuisine deserved respect regardless of politics. Lieutenant Ann Harrington was an Army nurse stationed in Osaka in 1946. She was assigned to oversee a civilian hospital that treated both Japanese civilians and American personnel. The hospital was desperately undersupplied. Medicines were scarce. Equipment was outdated or broken. Staff were overworked and underpaid. Harrington did what she could with military supplies, but the needs exceeded what official channels could provide. She became friendly with one of the Japanese doctors, Dr. Taniguchi, who spoke excellent English and had trained at Johns Hopkins before the war. They worked long shifts together and developed professional respect that grew into genuine friendship despite the awkwardness of their respective positions. Taniguchi's family invited Harrington to dinner at their home, a gesture that represented considerable trust given the circumstances. The meal was simple: rice, miso soup, grilled fish, pickled vegetables. Nothing fancy because ingredients were limited. But it was prepared with care and served with a hospitality that made Harrington feel genuinely welcomed. Taniguchi's wife had used precious ingredients to make this meal special. Their children, initially shy, warmed up as the evening progressed and showed Harrington their books and toys. Harrington found herself moved by the experience in ways she hadn't anticipated. Here was a family that had every reason to hate Americans. They'd lost a son in the Philippines, their home had been damaged by bombing, they were struggling to survive in a devastated economy. Yet they had opened their home and shared their scarce food with her, treating her not as an enemy but as a guest deserving of hospitality. She reciprocated by bringing medical supplies to the hospital that officially she shouldn't have diverted. She used her connections to help the Taniguchi family get better housing. These weren't official programs but personal decisions to help people she'd come to care about. The friendship that developed between Harrington and the Taniguchi family would last decades, long after the occupation ended and she returned to America. They corresponded regularly. She visited Japan multiple times in later years. When she died in 1987, members of the Taniguchi family traveled to her funeral in Baltimore. Food created connections because it satisfied immediate physical needs while also serving as a cultural bridge. Americans who ate Japanese food learned that it represented a sophisticated culinary tradition worthy of respect. Japanese who received American food learned that generosity could come from unexpected sources. Both sides discovered that sitting down to share a meal together created a kind of temporary peace where the normal categories of victor and vanquished mattered less than the simple human pleasure of eating together. The long-term impact of these exchanges would be profound. After the occupation ended and Japan began its economic recovery, interest in American food became part of Japanese popular culture. American-style restaurants proliferated. Fast food chains would later find huge success in Japan. Conversely, Japanese cuisine gradually gained respect in America, evolving from wartime enemy food to sophisticated dining. Sushi, ramen, and teriyaki would become mainstream American foods by the 1980s and 1990s. But in those early months of occupation, these future developments were unimaginable. What mattered was that food provided a way for two groups of people to interact on human terms. It created obligations of hospitality and gratitude that complicated simplified narratives about enemies and occupiers. It proved that cultural exchange could happen even under the most unlikely circumstances, that shared meals could create bonds stronger than political ideology or wartime hatred. Language is power, and in occupied Japan, English became the language of authority, commerce, and opportunity. Japanese who could speak English had access to better jobs, could communicate with occupation officials, and could navigate the new reality more effectively than those who couldn't. This created enormous demand for English education and put American soldiers, many of whom had no teaching experience, in the unexpected role of language instructors. The American military government recognized early that language instruction would be essential to the occupation's success. They established English language programs in schools, published textbooks, and encouraged interaction between Japanese civilians and American servicemen. But the most effective language learning happened through informal daily contact rather than through official programs. Corporal Frank Mitchell from New York found himself running impromptu English classes in Nagoya in early 1946. It started when a few Japanese teenagers approached him asking to learn English. Mitchell had no teaching experience but agreed to help. He met with them a few times a week in a damaged school building, using whatever materials he could find. The classes grew rapidly through word of mouth until he had 50 students ranging from children to elderly adults, all desperately eager to learn English. Mitchell discovered quickly that teaching a language you speak natively is harder than it seems. He couldn't explain grammar rules he'd never consciously learned. He struggled to break down English idioms and expressions that made no literal sense. But his students were motivated in ways that American students rarely were. They attended every session. They practiced religiously. They helped each other. Learning English wasn't an academic requirement but a survival skill. What surprised Mitchell was that the exchange went both ways. His students taught him Japanese in return. He learned not just vocabulary but cultural concepts that didn't translate directly. He learned about obligation and respect, about the subtle gradations of politeness that Japanese language builds into its structure. He learned that language shapes thought in ways he hadn't considered before, that how people speak influences how they understand the world. The students were curious about America in ways that challenged Mitchell to articulate things he'd taken for granted. They asked about American government, about democracy, about why Americans did things certain ways. Mitchell found himself trying to explain concepts like constitutional rights and free speech to people who had lived under authoritarian militarism. The questions forced him to think more carefully about his own country and its values. Yuriko Yamamoto was a university student before the war who now worked in an office that liaised with occupation officials. Her English was serviceable but not fluent, and she knew that improving it would be crucial for her career prospects. She attended evening classes run by American soldiers and practiced whenever she could with native speakers. The process of learning English changed how Yamamoto thought. English required direct statements in ways Japanese could soften or make ambiguous. English forced clear subjects and objects in sentences while Japanese could leave them implied. Learning to speak English meant learning to think in more direct, individualistic ways. This cognitive shift was part of what American authorities hoped would happen, that language instruction would carry democratic values and ways of thinking. But the exchange wasn't one-directional. American soldiers learning Japanese discovered a language that encoded complex social relationships in its grammar. The multiple levels of politeness and formality made them more aware of social context and hierarchies. Learning Japanese taught Americans about cultural values like harmony, consensus, and indirect communication that were different from but not inferior to American directness. These language exchanges created unexpected relationships. Students and teachers developed bonds that transcended their respective roles. Yamamoto became friends with the American soldier who taught her English class, a man from Idaho named Robert who was fascinated by Japanese literature. She helped him read Japanese texts phonetically, explaining cultural context that made the stories comprehensible. He helped her understand American slang and idioms that confused her when she heard them in movies. The friendships that developed through language learning complicated both sides' understanding of each other. Yamamoto couldn't maintain a simplistic view of Americans as barbarian occupiers when she knew Robert as an intelligent person who cared about poetry and wanted to understand Japanese culture. Robert couldn't maintain stereotypes about Japanese inscrutability when Yamamoto explained directly what she thought and felt, bridging the cultural gap through their shared linguistic efforts. Language barriers created constant comedy and occasional tragedy. Misunderstandings were inevitable when people didn't share fluent communication. American soldiers unintentionally insulted Japanese civilians by using language incorrectly. Japanese civilians confused Americans by being too indirect or polite for direct Anglo-Saxon communication styles. But these misunderstandings also forced both groups to develop patience, creativity, and willingness to see past linguistic confusion to underlying intent. Private George Tanaka was a Japanese-American soldier from Hawaii who spoke both English and Japanese fluently. He served as an interpreter for military government officials, translating meetings between American commanders and Japanese civilian authorities. The position gave him unique insight into how language shaped understanding on both sides. Tanaka found that translation wasn't just converting words but mediating between entirely different ways of structuring reality. Japanese officials spoke in elaborate circumlocutions that lost their meaning when translated directly into English. American commanders made blunt statements that sounded offensive or insulting when rendered in Japanese. Tanaka's job required understanding both linguistic systems deeply enough to convey meaning without losing cultural context. He also saw how language created power dynamics. Americans who spoke no Japanese relied completely on interpreters, giving those interpreters enormous influence over how messages were conveyed. Japanese who spoke English had advantages in negotiations because they could understand American discussions that weren't being translated. Language ability determined who had access to information and influence in the occupied society. The occupation's emphasis on English education had long-term effects that reshaped Japanese society. Children who learned English in occupation schools grew up to be adults who could engage with international business and culture. English became a required subject in Japanese education and a marker of sophistication and modernity. By the 1960s and 70s, Japan had among the highest rates of English study in the world, though fluency remained elusive for most students. For American soldiers, exposure to Japanese language and culture created a generation with deeper understanding of East Asia than any previous American cohort. Veterans who learned Japanese during occupation sometimes pursued careers in diplomacy, business, or academia focused on Japan. The relationships they formed during their service influenced American policy toward Japan for decades. But in those early months of occupation, the immediate impact of language exchange was more personal. It meant that Americans and Japanese could talk to each other, however imperfectly. They could ask questions, share stories, explain misunderstandings. Language learning forced both groups to see each other as individuals with thoughts and feelings worth understanding. It broke down the abstraction of the enemy, and replaced it with specific people with names and faces and stories. The barriers remained formidable. Few American soldiers became truly fluent in Japanese during their service. Few Japanese civilians became fully comfortable with English. But the effort to communicate created goodwill that transcended linguistic limitations. People trying hard to understand each other tend to grant each other grace and patience. They assume good intentions even when words come out wrong. These assumptions created space for relationships that the brutal logic of war and occupation should have made impossible. The most controversial and emotionally fraught encounters between Americans and Japanese involved romantic and sexual relationships. Military regulations officially discouraged fraternization, but human nature and wartime isolation made such connections inevitable. What emerged was a complex landscape of exploitation, genuine affection, social scandal, and ultimately the creation of families that embodied the fusion of two cultures. The power dynamics were impossible to ignore. American servicemen were part of an occupying force with access to money, food, and privilege that Japanese women couldn't hope to match. The economic desperation of post-war Japan drove many women into relationships with American soldiers for purely survival reasons. Prostitution flourished around American bases, creating a sex industry that served occupying forces while degrading the women involved. But within this exploitative context, genuine relationships also formed. American soldiers and Japanese women fell in love, married, and started families despite enormous social pressure against such unions. These relationships faced disapproval from both American and Japanese communities. They challenged racial prejudices, cultural assumptions, and the carefully maintained boundaries that were supposed to separate victor from vanquished. Sergeant William Bradford from Georgia met Kimiko Sato at a dance organized by the military government in Tokyo in 1946. These dances were awkward affairs where American soldiers and Japanese civilians were supposed to interact in structured social settings. Bradford was uncomfortable with the whole setup. The artificial cheerfulness, the language barriers, the obvious disparity in circumstances between well-fed American troops and Japanese civilians still recovering from near starvation. Kimiko approached him during the evening and asked in careful English if he would like to dance. Bradford was taken aback by her directness but agreed. They danced awkwardly to American big band music playing on scratchy phonograph records. They tried to talk, mixing English, Japanese, and gestures. Bradford learned that Kimiko had been a student before the war, that she'd lost her father in China, that she was working as a translator for a Japanese company trying to do business with occupation authorities. They began meeting regularly, at first for language practice and then simply because they enjoyed each other's company. The relationship developed slowly, constrained by cultural differences and the awkward reality that Bradford was part of an occupying army. They went to movies together, walked through parks, shared meals. Bradford introduced Kimiko to jazz music and American novels. Kimiko taught Bradford about Japanese poetry and took him to temples that had survived the bombing. When they decided to marry, both families were horrified. Bradford's parents in Georgia couldn't accept their son marrying the enemy, much less an Asian woman. Kimiko's mother worried about social ostracism and about her daughter leaving Japan to live in a country where she would face discrimination. Military authorities created bureaucratic obstacles to discourage such marriages. American servicemen had to get permission from their commanding officers to marry Japanese women, a requirement designed to limit these relationships. But Bradford and Kimiko persisted. They married in a small ceremony attended by a handful of friends who supported them despite social disapproval. Kimiko became one of approximately 50,000 Japanese women who married American servicemen during the occupation period and early post-war years. These women, often called war brides, faced enormous challenges adapting to life in America. They dealt with racism, isolation, and the shock of transplanting to a culture radically different from their own. Not all relationships between American men and Japanese women were as positive. The power imbalance created opportunities for exploitation that some men took advantage of. Women desperate for food or protection entered relationships with American soldiers knowing they had little bargaining power. Some were treated well, but others were used and discarded when the serviceman rotated home. The children from these relationships often faced discrimination in Japan, where racial homogeneity was the norm and mixed-race children were stigmatized. Lieutenant Sarah Connolly was an Army nurse who witnessed both the exploitation and the genuine connections. She ran a medical clinic that treated Japanese civilians, including women who formed relationships with American servicemen. Some came to the clinic with sexually transmitted diseases from prostitution. Others came for prenatal care after becoming pregnant by American boyfriends. Connolly tried to provide medical care without judgment, but she was acutely aware of the complicated dynamics at play. She saw women who were clearly being exploited by American soldiers who had no intention of maintaining the relationship. She also saw couples who were genuinely in love despite the difficult circumstances. Connolly helped facilitate a few marriages by navigating the military bureaucracy for soldiers who wanted to marry Japanese women. She provided medical letters, translations, and moral support for couples who faced opposition from both their own communities and military authorities. The children born from American-Japanese relationships during this period occupied a particularly difficult position. In Japan, they were often ostracized as Inoko, mixed blood, facing discrimination in schools and social settings. In America, if their mothers managed to bring them when following their servicemen husbands, they faced racism against both Asians and mixed-race individuals. These children embodied the human consequences of war and occupation, carrying in their very existence the complicated legacy of former enemies trying to coexist. Takashi Williams was born in Yokohama in 1947 to a Japanese mother and an African-American serviceman father. His father returned to America before Takashi was born, and his mother raised him alone in a society that viewed mixed-race children with suspicion and prejudice. Growing up, Takashi faced constant discrimination. Other children called him names. Teachers treated him differently. Opportunities available to pure Japanese were denied to him because of his mixed heritage. But Takashi's existence also represented something new, a fusion of cultures that would eventually become more accepted as Japan modernized and internationalized. The mixed-race children of the occupation period were pioneers, however unwillingly, of a more diverse Japanese society. Many eventually moved to America or other countries where racial mixing was more accepted. Those who remained in Japan often formed communities of support with others who shared their mixed heritage. The romantic relationships between Americans and Japanese during occupation challenged fundamental assumptions about race, culture, and enemy status. They proved that attraction and love could transcend the categories created by war. They also revealed the limits of individual choice in contexts shaped by massive power imbalances. A Japanese woman choosing to be with an American soldier in 1946 was making that choice in circumstances of economic desperation and military occupation that severely constrained what real choice meant. For American soldiers, relationships with Japanese women were complicated by both attraction and guilt. They were drawn to women who were culturally different, exotic in their American understanding. But they also had to confront that they represented a conquering force, that the power dynamics made truly equal relationships difficult. Some men handled this thoughtfully, treating their Japanese partners with respect and working to overcome cultural barriers. Others treated Japanese women as conquests, temporary entertainment before returning home to real, American girlfriends. The military's official policy discouraged fraternization but couldn't prevent it. Commanders worried about soldiers forming attachments that would undermine military discipline. They worried about security risks from relationships with former enemy populations. They worried about racial mixing in an era when many American states still had anti-miscegenation laws prohibiting interracial marriage. But desire and loneliness and human connection are hard to regulate through military orders. By 1950, as occupation ended and American troops began withdrawing from some positions, thousands of Japanese war brides were preparing to immigrate to America. Their stories became fodder for both melodrama and serious investigation into how cultural contact reshapes lives. Films, books, and newspaper articles told their stories, usually with more concern for drama than accuracy. The war brides were portrayed alternately as tragic figures abandoned by their homelands, as brave pioneers embracing new opportunities, or as suspicious foreigners who might not be trustworthy. The reality was more complicated than any single narrative could capture. Each relationship had its own dynamics, its own mixture of love, pragmatism, hope, and compromise. What united them was that they represented something unprecedented, large-scale intimacy between Americans and Japanese at a moment when both societies were supposed to maintain clear boundaries between victor and vanquished. That these boundaries were so thoroughly violated, that love and desire overrode political and military categories, suggested that the human need for connection was more powerful than official policies or cultural prohibitions. By 1948, 3 years into occupation, something fundamental had shifted in how Americans and Japanese saw each other. The changes weren't complete or universal, but they were unmistakable. The two groups had learned to coexist in ways that neither had thought possible in the war's immediate aftermath. What had seemed like an unbridgeable gulf of hatred and mutual incomprehension had been crossed by thousands of individual encounters that accumulated into something resembling understanding. For Japanese civilians, the transformation involved accepting that Americans were not the demons depicted in wartime propaganda. They learned that American soldiers could be kind, generous, thoughtful, and humane. This didn't erase awareness of American bombing campaigns or the devastation those campaigns had caused. But it complicated the narrative. It became harder to maintain pure hatred when specific Americans had helped your family survive, had given your children food, had treated you with respect when they could have treated you with contempt. The occupation's reforms were changing Japanese society in fundamental ways. Land reform redistributed property from large landowners to farmers who worked it. Education reform removed militaristic and ultranationalistic content from schools. Constitutional reform established democratic governance and enshrined civil rights. Women gained the right to vote. Labor unions were legalized. The entire structure of Japanese society was being rebuilt according to American models, sometimes successfully and sometimes creating friction with existing cultural patterns. But underneath these policy changes, the daily interactions between Americans and Japanese were creating subtler transformations. Japanese who worked with occupation authorities learned American business practices and organizational methods. Children who attended schools with American educational models learned different ways of thinking about authority and individual initiative. Families who hosted American soldiers or interacted with civil affairs officers absorbed American cultural values through osmosis even when they didn't consciously adopt them. Sergeant Harold Jensen had been in Japan since September 1945, longer than most servicemen. His job coordinating reconstruction efforts in Kobe had given him deep relationships with local officials and civilians. By 1948, he spoke passable Japanese and had formed genuine friendships with several Japanese colleagues. When his rotation orders finally came through, sending him back to Minnesota, Jensen felt genuinely sad about leaving. His farewell party was attended by dozens of Japanese civilians and officials he'd worked with over 3 years. They gave speeches thanking him for his service. They presented him with gifts, a set of lacquerware, a calligraphy scroll, a photo album documenting his time in Kobe. Jensen was moved to tears, which embarrassed him but which his Japanese friends seemed to understand and appreciate. They'd seen him evolve from a wary occupier to someone who genuinely cared about their city's recovery and their well-being. Jensen later wrote that leaving Japan felt like leaving family. The people he'd worked with had become more than professional contacts. They'd shared meals, celebrated holidays together, helped each other through difficulties. The fact that they'd once been enemies seemed almost meaningless compared to the relationships they'd built since. Jensen returned to America with a perspective on Japan that was radically different from the stereotypes he'd carried when he first landed at Atsugi Airfield in 1945. For Americans, the transformation involved learning that Japanese people were not the fanatical, subhuman warriors portrayed in wartime propaganda. They were people with rich cultural traditions, strong family bonds, extraordinary resilience, and admirable work ethics. American soldiers who spent years in Japan came to respect Japanese culture, appreciate Japanese aesthetics, and understand that the war had been fought by governments while civilians on both sides suffered. This understanding didn't make American soldiers retroactively regret fighting the war. Most believed the conflict had been necessary and that American victory had been just. But it complicated their feelings about the enemy they'd fought. It became harder to maintain that all Japanese deserved punishment when you knew specific Japanese families who'd been devastated by the war and who were trying to rebuild with dignity and grace. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the children born during these years. Japanese children growing up during occupation had different experiences than their parents' generation. They learned English in school. They played baseball and listened to American music. They watched American movies and absorbed American cultural references. They formed their understanding of the world in an environment where American presence was normal rather than shocking. Similarly, children of American servicemen born in Japan or to Japanese war bride mothers grew up with dual cultural influences. They ate both rice and hamburgers. They celebrated both Shinto festivals and Christian holidays. They spoke both Japanese and English, or at least grew up hearing both languages. These children would form the first generation of Japanese Americans who embodied cultural fusion rather than cultural conflict. The economic recovery of Japan, beginning in the late 1940s and accelerating through the 1950s, was enabled by American support but driven by Japanese effort. The occupation provided food aid, economic assistance, and access to American markets. But Japanese workers, engineers, and entrepreneurs rebuilt their country through extraordinary discipline and innovation. American and Japanese working together proved to be remarkably effective, combining American capital and technology with Japanese skill and determination. By 1950, Japan was manufacturing goods for export again. By 1952, when the occupation officially ended, Japan was on the path to becoming an economic powerhouse. The transformation from devastated enemy to trusted ally happened with remarkable speed, driven by Cold War strategic calculations but enabled by the relationships formed during occupation between individual Americans and Japanese. The transformation wasn't complete or without problems. Racism persisted on both sides. Many Americans never overcame prejudices against Japanese people. Many Japanese never forgave Americans for the bombings and occupation. The tensions that would periodically flare in later decades over trade issues, military bases, and historical memory had their roots in unresolved conflicts from the occupation period. But something unprecedented had happened. Two nations that had fought one of history's most brutal wars had learned to coexist peacefully and eventually prosperously. The individuals who made that possible weren't diplomats or politicians but ordinary soldiers and civilians who chose to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies. Their encounters, repeated millions of times in countless variations, created the foundation for a relationship that would become one of the most important bilateral partnerships in the post-war world. 75 years later, the relationship between Japan and the United States stands as one of the most successful examples of former enemies transforming into close allies. The alliance encompasses military cooperation, economic partnership, cultural exchange, and deep interpersonal connections. Japanese-American relations are generally characterized by mutual respect, though not without periodic tensions over trade, military bases, and historical memory. But this alliance wasn't inevitable. It was built by specific people in specific moments making choices that transcended the logic of war and occupation. The American GIs who shared chocolate with Japanese children, who helped rebuild destroyed cities, who learned to speak Japanese and appreciate Japanese culture. They laid groundwork that policymakers could build on. The Japanese civilians who chose to see Americans as potential partners rather than permanent enemies, who taught English, who opened their homes, who worked to rebuild rather than resist. They made transformation possible. The children of that era carry the legacy most directly. Now elderly themselves, they remember the occupation period with complicated emotions. Japanese who were children in 1945 to 1952 remember American soldiers with varying degrees of fondness, gratitude, and residual resentment. Some have warm memories of kindness received. Others remember humiliation and cultural disruption. Most carry a mixture of both. American veterans who served in occupation duty often developed lifelong affection for Japan and Japanese people. Many returned multiple times as tourists. Some maintained correspondence with Japanese friends for decades. Their experiences in Japan shaped how they raised their own children, what they taught about cultural difference, how they thought about former enemies and reconciliation. The war brides who moved to America faced enormous challenges but often succeeded in building lives that bridged two cultures. They raised children who were both Japanese and American, who could navigate both cultures with varying degrees of comfort. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren now represent a significant Japanese-American community that enriches both societies. The cultural exchange that began during occupation continues today in transformed ways. Japanese popular culture, manga, anime, video games, fashion, has become hugely influential globally. American popular culture remains enormously popular in Japan. Millions of tourists travel between the two countries annually. Thousands of students study in exchange programs. Business partnerships connect the economies deeply. This cultural fusion wouldn't have been possible without the foundation laid during those difficult early years of occupation. The willingness of both Americans and Japanese to see past propaganda and engage with each other as individuals created possibilities that rippled forward through generations. Every Japanese student studying in America, every American tourist appreciating Japanese aesthetics, Every business partnership between Japanese and American companies rests on a foundation built by people who chose humanity over hatred when both were possible. The lessons from this transformation are relevant beyond Japanese-American relations. They suggest that reconciliation between former enemies is possible when individuals on both sides are willing to engage across lines of conflict. They show that cultural exchange and interpersonal connection can undermine propaganda and prejudice. They demonstrate that official policy matters less than the accumulated effect of millions of small human interactions. But the history also carries warnings. The transformation happened in specific contexts that might not be replicable elsewhere. American occupation was relatively benign by historical standards of military occupation, partly because American strategic interests aligned with rebuilding Japan rather than punishing it. Japanese cultural values of discipline, group harmony, and respect for authority facilitated cooperation with occupation authorities in ways that might not occur in other cultural contexts. The Cold War gave both sides incentives to make the relationship work that pure goodwill alone might not have sustained. And not everyone benefited equally from the transformation. The war brides and their mixed-race children often paid heavy social costs. Japanese who had suffered most in the war sometimes felt betrayed by how quickly former enemies became partners. Korean and Chinese victims of Japanese imperialism watched with anger as America helped rebuild Japan while their own grievances against Japanese wartime atrocities remained unaddressed. Still, the central fact remains. Millions of individual encounters between Americans and Japanese during occupation created the foundation for a relationship that has endured and prospered for 3/4 of a century. The GI who gave chocolate to a hungry child, the Japanese mother who served tea to an American soldier, the young people who fell in love across cultural boundaries, they were participating in something larger than they knew. They were proving that enemies can become friends, that cultures can learn from each other, that humanity persists even through the machinery of war and occupation. Today, a visitor to Japan will find a society that has absorbed American influences while maintaining its distinct cultural identity. American military bases still operate in Japan, a reminder of the occupation's origins, but their presence is part of a mutual defense alliance rather than conquest. Japanese and American companies collaborate on technology, manufacturing, and innovation. Cultural exchange happens so naturally that young people on both sides sometimes forget this was once considered impossible. The old veterans from both sides are dying now, taking their memories with them. Soon there will be no one left who personally remembers those first awkward, frightening, hopeful encounters in the ruins of 1945. Their children and grandchildren carry forward stories filtered through time and shaped by subsequent experience. But something of that moment persists. A reminder that people have the power to choose what happens after war ends, that reconciliation is possible when individuals on both sides are willing to see each other as human. The most lasting memorial to the occupation period isn't any physical structure or official policy. It's the relationships that formed, the families that were created, the understanding that grew between two peoples who should have remained enemies but chose, through millions of small acts of recognition and respect, to become something else instead. Something that looked, from certain angles and in certain moments, almost like friends.